Prostitution, often referred to as the world's oldest profession, has a history that predates recorded civilization. Archaeological evidence from the ancient city of Uruk, located in modern-day Iraq, suggests that prostitution existed as early as 20,400 BCE. The earliest written records of prostitution come from the ancient Near East in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where sacred prostitution was a common practice, even an integral part of society. Evidence from ancient Mesopotamia, primarily Sumer and Babylonia, reveals that prostitution was institutionalized and regulated by law. Temples, the epicenters of economic and social activity, often housed sacred prostitutes, also known as temple or cult prostitutes. These women were considered servants of the goddess Ishtar, the deity of love, beauty, sex, and war. They participated in sexual rites as part of the religious practices and festivals believed to ensure the fertility and prosperity of the community. But prostitution was not limited to temples. There were also secular prostitutes, often slaves or destitute women, who worked in brothels or independently. The Code of Hammurabi, a Babylonian law code dating from the 18th century BC, contains several laws pertaining to prostitution, indicating its widespread acceptance and regulation. These laws included provisions for inheritance rights of prostitutes and penalties for crimes against prostitutes. It was a profession imbued with religious significance, legal recognition, and economic assistance, making it a vital part of the societal fabric of the time. In ancient Greece, prostitution was not only legal but also taxed by the state, and it played a significant role in society. The practice was widespread, and it was considered a necessary part of life, particularly in urban areas. The profession was populated by both men and women, and it was divided into several categories. The highest class was the heterae, who were educated, independent women who provided companionship and intellectual stimulation to their clients, in addition to sexual services. They were often hired by wealthy men for long-term relationships and were expected to participate in social events, engage in intellectual discussions, and even influence their clients' political decisions. The second category was the Aulatrides, who were often slaves or foreigners. They were primarily entertainers, skilled in playing the aulos, a Greek wind instrument, and dancing. They were usually hired for parties and could offer sexual services as well. The lowest class was the pornai, the majority of whom were slaves. They worked in brothels that were often owned by wealthy citizens. Their services were inexpensive, and they were available to most men, regardless of their social status. Their lives were harsh, and their work was dangerous, often leading to a short lifespan. The brothels in ancient Greece, known as dicteria, were usually small, often just a single room. The rooms were typically furnished with a bed and a lamp, and the walls were often adorned with erotic paintings. The brothels were usually located near the ports, catering to sailors and merchants. The prices for services varied, but it was generally affordable, even for the lower classes. The state played a significant role in regulating prostitution. The earnings of the prostitutes were taxed, and the state used the revenue for various public works. The state also set the prices for the services, ensuring that they remained affordable for most men. The brothels were often inspected by the state officials, and the prostitutes were required to undergo regular health checkups. Despite the state's involvement, the life of a prostitute was not easy. They were often mistreated by their clients and their owners, and they had little to no legal protection. They were also stigmatized by society, and they were often excluded from religious ceremonies and public events. However, they were also seen as a necessary part of society, providing a service that was in high demand. Despite the societal stigma, some prostitutes managed to rise above their circumstances. The heterae, in particular, were often able to gain significant influence and wealth. They were known for their wit, beauty, and intellectual prowess, and they were often sought after by the most powerful men in society. Some heterae even managed to achieve a degree of fame and notoriety, with their names and stories being recorded in history. One such example is Phryne, a hetera who became one of the richest women in Athens. She was known for her extraordinary beauty, and she was the model for many of the statues of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. However, the lives of most prostitutes in ancient Greece were far from glamorous. In contrast, in ancient Rome, the profession was typically practiced by slaves, although freeborn women and men could also choose this path. The Roman word for prostitute was meretrix, derived from the Latin mere, meaning to earn. However, it was not a respected profession. Roman moralists viewed it as a necessary evil, a means to satisfy the base desires of men and prevent the corruption of Roman people. Despite this, prostitutes were often featured in Roman literature and art, a testament to their irreplaceable presence in society. The prostitutes worked in brothels, which were often located in the Suburra, Rome's red light district. Each prostitute had a small room called a cella where they would meet their clients. The prices for services varied greatly, depending on the attractiveness and age of the prostitute, as well as the client's wealth. In addition to brothels, prostitution also occurred in various other venues across the city. Roman baths, taverns, and even graveyards were known to be places where prostitutes served clients. Street prostitutes, known as bustuariae, often operated near tombs outside the city walls, a practice that was considered particularly disgraceful by Roman society. Prostitutes were required to register with the city officials responsible for maintaining public order. They were also subject to a tax known as the vectigal, which was collected by the state. Failure to pay this tax could result in severe penalties, including reclassification as an infamous, a person stripped of their legal and social rights. Prostitutes were also required to wear distinctive clothing, typically a toga, which was otherwise only worn by men. This was intended to clearly distinguish them from respectable Roman matrons. They were also often required to dye their hair blonde or wear blonde wigs, as the Romans associated blonde hair with exoticism and sexual availability. The legal status of prostitutes in Roman society was complex. While they were not technically slaves, they were not free citizens either. They were considered infames, a legal status that deprived them of most civil rights. They could not vote, hold public office, or even make a will. Despite the harsh conditions and societal scorn, prostitution remained a needed part of Roman society. It was seen as a necessary evil, a way to protect the virtue of Roman wives and prevent the spread of adultery. Middle Ages saw a significant shift in the perception and treatment of prostitutes. In early medieval times, prostitution was not explicitly illegal. The Church, while disapproving of sexual immorality, was more focused on issues of heresy and paganism. Moreover, the societal structure of the time, based on feudalism, left many women without economic support, leading some to turn to prostitution for survival. This was especially true during times of war and famine, which were frequent in the Middle Ages. In the 12th and 13th centuries, however, the Church began to take a more active role in regulating morality, including prostitution. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, for instance, mandated that prostitutes should be segregated from the rest of the society, leading to the establishment of red light districts in many European cities. Yet, despite such measures, prostitution remained a pervasive part of medieval society, often tolerated for its perceived ability to prevent more serious sexual crimes. It was a paradoxical situation, condemned by the Church, yet half secretly accepted and even regulated by secular authorities. The Middle Ages also witnessed the rise of brothels, known as stew houses in England, which were often licensed and regulated by local authorities. These establishments were usually subject to various rules, such as restrictions on their hours of operation and the types of services they could offer. In the 14th century, for instance, the City of London bought and managed 31 brothels in Southwark. The city used the profits from these establishments to fund public works and other civic projects. While brothel keeping was considered a legitimate, if morally dubious, profession, individual street prostitutes were often treated with disrespect and faced harsh penalties if caught. They could be publicly shamed, whipped, or even banished from the city. The demand for their services still remained high, fueled by a large population of unmarried men, including clerics, students, and soldiers. In many cities, prostitutes were required to wear distinctive clothing to set them apart from other women. This could include a particular color, such as red or striped garments, or a specific item, like a veil or a badge. These regulations were intended to protect the honor of respectable women and prevent any confusion about a woman's status. In addition to clothing regulations, prostitutes were often barred from certain public spaces, such as churches and marketplaces, and were not allowed to marry or inherit property. These measures served to reinforce the social marginalization of prostitutes and limit their opportunities for social advancement. Despite these restrictions, fines and licenses paid by prostitutes and brothel owners were a significant source of revenue for many medieval cities. This economic incentive often led to a pragmatic approach to enforcement, with authorities turning a blind eye to prostitution as long as it remained discreet and orderly. The lives of medieval prostitutes were often difficult and dangerous. They faced the risk of violence from clients, exploitation by brothel owners, and the threat of sexually transmitted diseases, which were poorly understood and often fatal. In many places, prostitutes were not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground, reflecting their outcast status. Their existence reflected the realities of medieval life, with its rigid social hierarchies, economic inequalities, and complex attitudes towards sex and morality. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, attitudes towards prostitution began to change. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century brought a new emphasis on moral purity and a rejection of the necessary evil argument. Many Protestant leaders, such as Martin Luther, called for the abolition of brothels and the punishment of prostitutes. Similarly, the rise of humanism and the rediscovery of classical texts led to a re-evaluation of women's roles and sexuality. Some humanist thinkers, like Desiderius Erasmus, advocated for the education of women and the promotion of marriage as an alternative to prostitution. In the 16th and 17th centuries, prostitution was a complex phenomenon. In Europe, it was both a social reality and a legal issue. Prostitutes were at high risk of contracting venereal diseases, which were rampant and often deadly in the 16th and 17th centuries. Despite the risks, many women found prostitution to be a more attractive option than other forms of labor available to them, such as domestic service or manual labor. In 1546, Henry VIII closed the brothels in England, pushing prostitution underground. However, it continued to thrive, especially in London, where it was estimated that 1 in 5 women were engaged in the sex trade by the late 16th century. In France, King Louis IX attempted to ban prostitution in the 13th century, but it was King Francis I who established state-controlled brothels in the 16th century. These establishments, known as maisons de tolérance, were intended to limit prostitution to certain areas and control its spread. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Catholic Church was grappling with the issue of prostitution. In 1563, the Council of Trent declared that prostitution was a lesser evil than having sex outside of marriage, leading to a high rise in the number of brothels in Italian cities. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Reformed Church, despite its moral objections, accepted prostitution as a necessary evil, and the church even owned brothels and rented them out to prostitutes, using the proceeds for charitable purposes. The first recorded instance of prostitution in South American English colonies dates back to 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. The colony, predominantly male, faced a severe shortage of women. This imbalance led to the emergence of prostitution as a means of addressing the men's needs. In 1620, the Virginia Company began sponsoring the transportation of young, single women, known as tobacco brides, to the colony. These women were essentially sold to the highest bidder in exchange for tobacco, a valuable commodity. The mid-17th century saw the emergence of more organized forms of prostitution in the English colonies. In New Amsterdam, later renamed New York, public houses or taverns became common venues for prostitution. These establishments were often owned and operated by women. Meanwhile, in the southern colonies, particularly in Maryland and Virginia, the plantation system led to a unique form of prostitution. Enslaved African women were often forced into sexual labor by their owners. By the end of the 17th century, prostitution had become a deeply entrenched aspect of colonial life in America. As we move into the 19th century, the landscape of prostitution began to change. Industrialization brought about significant shifts in society, leading to an increase in urban populations and the growth of a new working class. This, coupled with the lack of economic opportunities for women, led to an increase in prostitution. In the United Kingdom, the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s represented a significant shift in the state's approach to prostitution. These laws allowed police officers to arrest women suspected of being prostitutes in certain areas and subject them to mandatory checks for venereal diseases. If found to be infected, the women could be confined in lock hospitals until cured or for a maximum of 1 year. In France, the regulationist policy of the 18th century continued, with the introduction of compulsory health checks for prostitutes in 1802. In the United States, the 19th century saw a move towards more punitive measures against prostitution. The social purity movement gained traction, leading to the introduction of laws criminalizing prostitution in many states. By the end of the century, almost every state had laws against prostitution on the books. The 19th century also saw the emergence of a more organized and commercialized sex industry. In many cities, red light districts where prostitution was concentrated became established. These districts were often located in the poorer parts of the city and were characterized by a high density of brothels and other establishments associated with the sex trade. The nature of prostitution also changed during this period. While street prostitution continued to be common, the 19th century saw the rise of brothel prostitution. Brothels ranged from low-end establishments catering to the working class to high-end parlor houses that catered to the upper classes. In these establishments, prostitutes were often employed by a madam who provided them with room and board in exchange for a share of their earnings. The 19th century also saw the rise of white slavery, a term used to describe the coerced or forced prostitution of women. This phenomenon was particularly associated with the migration of women from rural areas to cities and from Europe to the Americas, where they were often deceived or forced into prostitution. The turn of the 20th century saw the rise of social purity movements that tried to remove prostitution entirely. These movements, often led by middle-class women, viewed prostitution as a form of exploitation and a symptom of social downfall. In 1910, the United States passed the Mann Act, also known as the White Slave Traffic Act, which made it illegal to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. Simultaneously, the early 20th century marked a period of increased international cooperation in the fight against the trafficking of women and children for sexual exploitation. The 1904 International Agreement for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic, followed by the 1910 International Convention for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic, marked the first international efforts to combat human trafficking. Despite these efforts, prostitution continued to thrive in the shadows of society. The economic hardships of the Great Depression in the 1930s led to a wave in street prostitution, as many women turned to sex work as a means of survival. The aftermath of World War II saw a shift in attitudes towards prostitution, with many countries moving towards decriminalization or regulation. In 1949, the United Nations adopted the Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and of the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others, which called for the punishment of those who exploit the prostitution of others, rather than the prostitutes themselves. In the latter half of the 20th century, several countries, including parts of Nevada in the United States, the Netherlands, and Germany, legalized and regulated prostitution, arguing that it would help protect sex workers and reduce the incidence of sex trafficking. These countries implemented systems of licensed brothels, mandatory health checks, and other regulations to ensure the safety and rights of sex workers. However, the debate over the best approach to prostitution continues to this day. Some argue for the so-called Swedish model, which criminalizes the purchase of sex, but not the selling of it, in an effort to reduce demand and protect sex workers. Others advocate for full decriminalization, arguing that it is the only way to ensure the rights and safety of all sex workers. Despite these differing approaches, the history of prostitution shows that it is a complex issue that has been a part of human societies for millennia. In the 21st century, the debate around prostitution has become more nuanced, focusing on issues of gender equality, human rights, and the role of societal structures. The rise of the internet has also transformed the industry, allowing for greater anonymity and ease of communication between clients and sex workers. In 2000, the Palermo Protocol was adopted. This international legal agreement is dedicated to combating human trafficking, including the exploitation of prostitution. It emphasizes the importance of consent and differentiates between voluntary sex work and forced prostitution. In the same vein, the World Health Organization released a statement in 2012 advocating for the decriminalization of sex work to improve the health and safety of sex workers. They argue that criminalization increases vulnerability to HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, as well as violence, poor health, and exploitation. However, despite these advances, many challenges remain. The criminalization of sex work in many parts of the world continues to expose sex workers to violence, discrimination, and other forms of harm. And to end it all, here's a story of the most legendary prostitute throughout history. Her tale begins in the 15th century in the city of Rome. Fiammetta Bianchini, born in 1440. Fiammetta's early life was marked by hardship. Orphaned at a young age, she was forced into prostitution to survive. However, her beauty, wit, and charm soon caught the attention of Rome's elite. By her late teens, she had become a celebrated figure in Rome's high society, renowned for her intelligence and conversational skills as much as her physical allure. In 1457, Fiammetta caught the eye of the wealthy and influential Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia. Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI, was a notorious womanizer. Their relationship, which was both passionate and volatile, lasted for several years and significantly elevated Fiammetta's status in society. Her relationship with Cardinal Borgia ended in 1460, but her notoriety continued to grow. Fiammetta's influence reached its zenith in the late 1460s when she became the mistress of Giuliano de' Medici, the brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, ruler of the Florentine Republic. Fiammetta's relationship with Giuliano was more than just a business arrangement. The two shared a deep emotional connection, and Giuliano even fathered a child with Fiammetta. Their relationship lasted until Giuliano's assassination in 1478. Despite facing numerous challenges, Fiammetta managed to maintain her status and influence. She was known for her lavish lifestyle, hosting extravagant parties attended by Rome's elite. Fiammetta's fame even reached the ears of foreign writers, making her one of the most well-known figures in 15th century Europe.